Hey folks, Zach Osterman here, you Insider Indianapolis Star. This is your Friday rundown for August 30th, 2024. We're going to try and bring these back, kind of discontinue them through the spring and summer when there wasn't as much going on. But obviously, this being the first weekend of football season, there's quite a bit going on. Just mostly going to use this to kind of run back through some of what we've put together in the past week or so, how that sort of advances toward the weekend. Football, obviously, a focus, but not necessarily the only focus. But to start with football, Indiana FIU at Indiana FIU at 3:30 on Saturday. We have quite a bit of content, as you would imagine, around this week. I think, in particular, I think I might have turned some heads when I predicted Indiana would go 9-4. I'll get to that in a minute, but a few different things. You can find all this indystar.com/sports/Hoosiers. A best case, worst case scenario, a piece, and I'll try to link to some of this down in the bio for the show. A piece about basically 5 players who I think the way we teased it was 5 players who will have fans reaching for their programs. Basically, 5 players that I think fans will know a lot more about if they stay healthy. By the end of the season than they do right now. It's a bit of a spoiler, but they're all transfers. And then let's see. It was best case, worst case. You have 5 bold predictions. I had 4. The record was one of them. Another was that Curtis Rourke will have one of the best individual seasons for a quarterback in program history. If you look at his numbers, if you look at the numbers that some of Curt Cignetti's quarterbacks have put up in the past, that's probably not that bold of a prediction. He's got to stay healthy. That's always true of a QB. But it's not hard to see him having the kind of season that would rival some of the best. Kellen Lewis 2007, Ben Chappell 2010, Nate Sudfeld 2015, Richard Lego 2016. Those are kind of the big ones in terms of an individual season by one quarterback, maybe not by a couple. You think back to like that 2019 season when Peyton Ramsey and Michael Penix together had a case for a really good sort of collective season, but just by one player. So there were the bold predictions on the website as well, and then yes, the schedule breakdown. I guess to kind of walk through this. And I wrote about my thought process. I tried to show my work in the piece, but basically where I broke it down was, number one, I had to kind of assume that a lot of these players would stay healthy, that in particular Curtis Rourke would stay healthy, that his offensive line would stay healthy. Once I assumed that, I asked myself kind of 3 questions. Number one, do I feel like Indiana has the advantage in the coaching matchup? Number 2, do I feel like Indiana has the advantage in the quarterback matchup? And number 3, is the game at home or on the road? And I settled on 5 games that I thought Indiana should win based on that sort of formula, as long as everybody is healthy. That was FIU, Western Illinois, Charlotte, UCLA, and Purdue. The UCLA and Purdue games acknowledging for what we might not know about those teams, but Curt Cignetti a lot more experienced. Not necessarily time may prove not necessarily a much better coach than Deshaun Foster or Ryan Walters, but a much more experienced coach than either of those men. I think Indiana's got the quarterback advantage against UCLA, and obviously the bucket games in Bloomington. So that tilted me toward moving Purdue and UCLA into the win column. I said, Michigan and Ohio State kind of automatically in the loss category, and that left me with 5 games that were in order on the schedule: Maryland, at Northwestern, Nebraska, Washington, Michigan State. You can kind of make a case for any of those. Northwestern is a team that surprised people last year. Can they sustain that this year? How's that stadium going to play? From an atmosphere perspective, frankly, just from like a weather perspective, it's right on the lake. Fall in Chicago, it can be very windy. It's going to be hard to throw there. Nebraska is a team that I could see arriving in Bloomington with a similar amount of momentum to Indiana. So that could be the kind of game where it's 2 teams kind of fighting for control of a season that is already moving at a certain pace and in a certain direction for both of them. Indiana gets Washington in the midst of a stretch that's very difficult for Washington, some really difficult road trips and a couple difficult home games. And then Indiana gets Michigan State on the road, but they get Michigan State, a team that has had a similar amount of turnover, an impressive coaching hire, just like Indiana. but they get Michigan State on the back of a brutal month where they go to Boston College, they host Ohio State, they go to Oregon, I think, and then host Iowa, and then go to Michigan, and then play Indiana. And I actually picked Indiana to lose the Michigan State game, but my thought process was basically that I could make you a compelling case based on those three factors I talked about for Indiana being able to win at least three of those games, and to go 3-2 over those 5 games. I just basically split the difference. I had them losing the road games, winning the home games. That puts them at 8-4. Obviously, they win the bucket in that situation. I picked them to go to the Music City Bowl purely because I would like to go to Nashville. So that was pretty selfish on my part. But Mike Nizilik, my beat counterpart over at the Bloomington Herald-Times, I thought made a really good point about a potential bowl game, because I think he predicted Indiana to win either 7 or 8 games, but in one of those being a bowl as well. He said that he thought if Indiana got to a bowl, there would be just sort of like a momentum and an energy around Indiana's season that would sort of lend itself to maybe fewer guys opting out, because that's such a big part of the complexion of bowl games anymore is who's still with the team by the time you get to kickoff. And if Indiana had won 8 games and maybe had a favorable matchup in a bowl and could become the team, only the third team in IU history to win 9 games in Kurt Cignetti's first season, all of this stuff considered, I just thought, that is a reason why Indiana might be able to win a bowl game, to have the advantage in a bowl game, is because they would be in a position to maybe retain more of those potential opt-outs. So bowl games are kind of a movable feast. You never know quite what you're going to get matchup-wise or weather-wise or anything like that. So, that projection was a little bit more out there. But that's how I settled on 9 wins. That's the methodology. I'm fully prepared to be proven wrong. Would hardly be the first time, but that is, to kind of show my work, that is how I got to 9 wins. And that was probably the piece of content that got everybody talking the most this week. The other big story we had, and I wanted to mention this before we go, because I've worked on this on and off throughout the summer, but a story on Indiana's long-term investment in women's sports, and this goes back 10 years or more to Fred Glass's tenure, and a lot of Fred Glass's work between sort of being a good steward of Big Ten media rights money and also fundraising for things like the renovation of Assembly Hall, Andy Moore Field, Bart Kaufman Field, the softball and baseball facility over on the bypass. But one of Fred Glass's long-term focuses, which was very much picked up and probably even more heavily emphasized by Scott Dolson, was this idea of essentially trying to invest in women's sports at a level, whether it was facilities, staffing, resources, whatever, that would raise all boats, because Indiana really has, and it's, I don't know that it's necessarily been, through any sort of, malicious intent, but Indiana has just never been able to sustain a lot of success in most of its women's sports. Of Indiana's 25 national championships, team national championships, only one, tennis in 1982, came in a women's sport. I think it's fair to say that Indiana's financial struggles in the late 90s and 2000s as a whole department hit women's sports pretty hard from a facilities perspective, from a coaching, staffing, salary perspective. And when Glass brought in 24 Sports One Team, which I know is a bit of a sort of a mantra that I think at times became a stick to beat him with. But that was what he had in mind, was this idea of creating a culture where the department was going to be intentional about pulling all of its programs up, and its women's programs in particular. And when Scott Dolson sat down with the athletic director search committee in 2019 or 2020, I think it would have been early 2020 by the time he sat with them, one of the pillars of kind of his vision for the job was continuing that, and if anything, really sort of doubling down on the idea of getting what am I looking for? Forgive me. Getting sort of women's sports to just continue to be moving in a positive direction. Indiana spent more on women's sports. It's poured more money in a raw sense into women's sports. It's favorable to some of its peers in the Big Ten, your Illinois, your Purdue's, your Michigan States and so forth in terms of how it spends its money on women's sports, which is obviously really important. Um, so it's just kind of, it was a piece talking to coaches, talking to former athletes, talking to administrators, not just Dolson, but sport administrators and people like that, about essentially what has allowed Indiana to be more successful. Because if you look across the board, while I was talking here, I pulled up the women's soccer schedule. Women's soccer is one of these programs. Last year was their first NCAA tournament berth in 10 years. It was their highest points total in Big Ten play ever. And they've already started this season 3-0. You look at volleyball is a program that, won 21 games last season, expected to be at least in the NCAA tournament conversation this year. Obviously, women's basketball, women's swimming and diving, programs like that, have continued to move up. Softball's been in the last two Big Ten championship games. So it's, obviously in the end, I think everyone will say that they measure their success in championships and trophies and that sort of thing. But it is one where across the board, you're seeing a lot of women's sports, starting to rise in a really positive direction for Indiana. And that's not by accident. That is the product of, 10, 12 years of concerted effort to try and build solid foundations that could then be sort of constructed upon to keep moving upward. And that story is also at indystar.com/sports/Hoosiers. I think, I appreciate everybody who kind of read it and circulated it the last couple days. But if you want to read that, that'll also be in the. I'll also put that down in the links in the comment section for this video. So those are the big things for this week. Not a ton else to report. Men's soccer picked up a draw last night. I think Notre Dame got a late goal to bring it back to 2-2. But I don't think long-term expectations are going to change very much for IU men's soccer this season. Again, women's soccer started well. Volleyball's on the road down in Kennesaw, Georgia, which is a suburb of Atlanta tonight. Obviously, football will play 3:30 tomorrow. It's Kurt Cignetti's first game, season opener against Florida Atlantic. And I think that's probably the best place to leave it. Next week, we will have at least one Mind Your Banners, if not two. I think Mike and I might fire up kind of our Sunday recap, Mind Your Banners, and then do one midweek after we talk to Kurt Cignetti and players and things like that. So be on the lookout for that. Be on the lookout for all of our coverage at indystar.com/sports. And thank you so much for watching. For Zach Osterman for the Indianapolis Star, I'm Zach Osterman. I was moving a little too quickly through that outro. We'll talk to you soon.